Assalamu alaikum ji. We are into organizational psychology again, and we are in the 5th lecture today. इससे पिछली दफ़े हमने आपसे दो बहुत इम्पॉर्टेंट चीज़ों का जिक्र किया था जिनका आपस में भी गहरा ताल्लुक़ है. Lecture number 3 was related to globalization, and lecture number 4 was related to culture, organizational culture. और हमने आपको बताया था कि ग्लोबलाइजेशन की वजह से ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस जो हैं वो मल्टीनेशनलाइज हो रही हैं, इंटरनेशनलाइज हो रही हैं. Therefore, it is the demand of organizations and people in the organizations to be able to understand and adjust to different cultures that they are exposed to as a function of their expansion into various regions of the world where different cultures are practiced. और लेक्चर नंबर 4 में हमने आपको बताया था कि कल्चर क्या है और इसके क्या क्या पॉसिबल असरात हैं ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल बिहेवियर या ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल साइकोलॉजी पे. जल्दी से रिकैप कर लेते हैं 1-2 मिनट में कि हमने माहिरीन नफ्सियात ने अपनी तहकीक के ज़रिए देखा है that there are cultural differences in terms of self-perception, in terms of time dimension, in terms of relationship with the world, and in terms of usage of public and private space. और फिर मैंने दो अहम तहकीकात का जिक्र किया था आपसे इससे मुतल्लिक, और ये देखा था हमने इस रेफरेंस में that one research undertaken by Hofstede showed that there are cultural differences in individualism, there were cultural differences in masculinity, femininity, there were cultural differences in uncertainty avoidance. और इसी तरह से एक और रिसर्चर ने देखा था जिसका नाम था फॉन्स ट्रॉम्पिनार, that there are cultural differences in individualism and collectivism. He also saw that there are cultural differences in what he called universalism and particularism, and he saw cultural differences in affective versus neutral, जहाँ कुछ कल्चर्स ऐसे हैं जो अपना जज्बात का इजहार कम करते हैं ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस में, और कुछ कल्चर्स ऐसे हैं जहाँ जज्बात का इजहार खुला किया जाता है. And then he also saw that there are differences across organizations in different cultures where people regard achievement of a person or people regard the background of a person as important in terms of organizational psychology. ये हमने असरात देखे थे पिछले लेक्चर में. अब इससे आगे चलते हैं and take a look at another element that has been introduced in organizational psychology, and that is the element of diversity. Diversity in organization refers to any given organization having people in it with different psychological makeups. किसी भी ऑर्गेनाइजेशन को आप लीजिए, उसमें मुख्तलिफ किस्म के लोग हैं जिनकी वेरीड नफ्सियात है, जिनके बैकग्राउंड मुख्तलिफ हैं, जिनकी जेंडर्स मुख्तलिफ हैं, जिनकी एजुकेशनल क्वालिफिकेशंस मुख्तलिफ हैं, जिनके रिलीजियस बिलीफ्स मुख्तलिफ हैं. लेकिन ये चीज़ें जो हैं ये अब बहुत ज़्यादा इम्पॉर्टेंस गेन कर गई हैं. एंड दिस इज व्हाट इज मेंट बाय डाइवर्सिटी इन ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस. एक बात जो मैं इस रेफरेंस में आपसे ज़रूर कहना चाहूँगा वो है, प्लीज़ डू नॉट कंफ्यूज ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल डाइवर्सिटी विद organizational diversification. Diversification is when an organization adopts new methodologies of production or marketing or goes into other areas which may or may not be related to its present functions. मिसाल के तौर पर अगर एक आइसक्रीम बनाने वाली कंपनी कपड़े भी बनाने शुरू करे या जूते भी बनाने शुरू करे या गाड़ियों के टायर्स बनाने शुरू करे तो दैट वुड बी डाइवर्सिफिकेशन. दैट इज नॉट व्हाट वी आर टॉकिंग अबाउट. वी आर टॉकिंग अबाउट डाइवर्सिटी. If an organization is into, let us say, making shoes, and then it goes into making cloth, and then it goes into making ice cream, these are examples of diversification of the organization. We are not talking about diversification of the organization. We are talking about diversity. Diversity means that any given organization has people whose psychological makeups are different. That's what diversity is. Diversity refers to the differences amongst people, amongst groups in an organization. So please do not confuse diversity with diversification. अब diversity का organizational psychology से क्या ताल्लुक है ये भी देखते हैं. लेकिन इससे पहले let us see what are the basis for diversity in organizations and why do we have to talk about diversity now in relation to organizations and organizational psychology. After all, organizations have existed for, let us say, about 150 to 100 years if we are talking about industrial organizations or manufacturing organizations. So why are we now talking about it? Talking about diversity in organizations with such gusto and with such references. उसकी एक वजह ये है कि जैसे मैंने आपको अभी इस लेक्चर के शुरू में रीकैप के दौरान बताया कि the world is moving at a very rapid pace. Globalization is changing the nomenclature of the world. Therefore, organizational cultures are changing because organizations are being internationalized. Because of internationalization of organizations, they are employing people, they are taking in people, they are training people who belong to various backgrounds, who belong to various ages, who belong to various genders, who belong to various ethnicity, who belong to various cultural backgrounds. कोई मिसाल ले लीजिए, आप एक फास्ट फूड कंपनी की मिसाल ले लीजिए. Fast food company is, a given fast food company may be spread over an entire continent or more than 2 continents or 3 continents. Because that company is spread over a continent or 2 continents or 3 continents, that company or that organization, which is a single organization, a fast food manufacturing and marketing and selling company, employs people who belong to different ethnic backgrounds, who have different cultural belongingness, who have different educational standards, who have different genders, who have different age groups. पहले भी ऐसा ही था, but the velocity of diversity has increased tremendously. पहले भी globalization थी, but now globalization velocity and volume and speed with which it's taking place has increased tremendously. And the same is the case with diversity. पहले भी organizations में मुख्तलिफ किस्म के लोग थे, उनकी नफ्सियात मुख्तलिफ थी, individual differences थे, लेकिन अब ये डाइवर्सिटी जो है ये बहुत बढ़ गई है. इसकी रफ्तार, इसका वॉल्यूम, इसकी मिकदार जो है वो बहुत बढ़ गई है. इसलिए डाइवर्सिटी का ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस पर और ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल साइकोलॉजी पर बहुत गहरा असर है. चलिए इसको भी समझ लेते हैं कि डाइवर्सिटी कैसे हो सकती है. एक ही कंपनी में बहुत से उम्र के लोग शामिल हो सकते हैं. कुछ 60 बरस के हैं, कुछ 30 बरस के हैं, कुछ 20 बरस के हैं, क्या आप समझते हैं कि वो लोग जो 20 बरस उम्र है जिनकी, क्या उनकी नफ्सियात भी वही होगी जो कि नफ्सियात उन लोगों की है जो लेट अस से आर 40 years old? And do you think that the psychology of people who are 40 years old is the same or similar to the psychology of people who are 55 or 60? एक और इस रेफरेंस में आपको बात बताऊं कि अब organizations are moving towards a policy where they are not retiring people. They are happy to involve people in their employment past the so-called retirement age. The concept of retirement age is fast diminishing. In the developed countries, for instance, particularly in educational institutions and other places, people are given the choice. If they want to continue with their job, they can continue with their job, because organizations feel that people who have experience can contribute by their experience in the organization. So they retain those people. इसलिए ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस, जो आजकल की जो ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस हैं, उनमें एज के लिहाज से डाइवर्सिटी शामिल होती चली जा रही है और पहले से बहुत बढ़ रही है. एक और रेफरेंस इस बात में मैं देना चाहूंगा कि एक 20 या 22 बरस का लड़का या लड़की जो है, जब वो किसी ऑर्गेनाइजेशन को ज्वाइन करता है, जब वो किसी ऑर्गेनाइजेशन का हिस्सा बनता है, तो उसकी नीड्स और उसकी मोटिवेशंस और उसकी विशेस एंड डिजायर्स और उसके प्रोपेलिंग एजेंट्स जो हैं, वेरिएबल्स जो हैं पर्सनैलिटी के, वो बिल्कुल मुख्तलिफ हैं उस शख्स से जो एक 40 बरस की उम्र का है. कैसे? क्योंकि 20 बरस की उम्र के लड़के या लड़की ने कैरियर डेवलप करना है, शादी करनी है, बीवी बच्चे घर बार बनाना है. इसलिए उसके जो मोटिव्स हैं, उसके जो इंटरेस्ट्स हैं, उसकी जो ड्राइविंग फोर्सेस हैं, उसके जो साइकोलॉजिकल मोटिवेटर्स हैं, दे आर डिफरेंट फ्रॉम, लेट अस से, ए पर्सन हु इज 40 years old. Somebody who is 40 years old in an organization, he or she is married, he or she is settled, he or she has some children, and his needs are different from the needs of a 20-year-old. The need of the 40 years, an employee who is 40 years old is to send his or her children to good schools, to be able to save some money so that they can educate their children when they go abroad, to save some money so that they can get their children married off when the children get into marriageable ages. इसलिए 40-year-old की needs जो हैं, वो 20-year-old की नीड से इन एन ऑर्गेनाइजेशन आर रेडिकली डिफरेंट. इसी तरह से एक और भी मिसाल लीजिए आप कि उन लोगों की नीड्स जो 55 या 60 बरस की उम्र के हैं और एक ऑर्गेनाइजेशन में हैं, क्या उनकी भी वही नीड्स हैं जो 20 बरस के एम्प्लॉयज की हैं या जो 40 बरस के एम्प्लॉयज की हैं? बुनियादी तौर पे तो वही नीड्स हैं, बट अपार्ट फ्रॉम दैट, people who are 60, 55 years old, their needs and their motives are different. They are looking now more towards retirement plans, more towards health plans, more towards paid holidays, more towards performing Hajj and Umrah, rather than raising a family, rather than getting married, rather than sending children abroad for education, rather than marrying their children off. So the needs, motives of 60-year-olds are different from motives of the 40-year-olds whose needs and motives are different from those who are 20 years old. So we have a list of these people who differ in their needs and psychological makeups, all contained under the same roof in an organization, and that is how they are diverse. And that is how diversity is expressing itself in terms of age in an organization. Diversity is also expressing itself in terms of gender in an organization. औरतों की नीड, औरतों की मोटिव्स, औरतों के साइकोलॉजिकल मेकअप, मर्दों की नीड्स, मर्दों के मोटिव्स और मर्दों के साइकोलॉजिकल मेकअप से मुख्तलिफ हैं. ये आप जब जेंडर का कोर्स पढ़ेंगे आपको इस पे बहुत डिटेल से पता चलेगा. मिसाल के तौर पर a woman in an organization, when she goes back home, she is a second earner in the family, whereas a man, under the given circumstances in the world today, he is the primary bread earner. A woman has to look after her children. A woman has to dress her children. A woman has to prepare food for the family. A man doesn't have to do that at home. So, when women and men work together, women are under more pressure so far as homework, housework, child rearing practices are concerned. Similarly, men have to be the main bread earner. They have to buy the cars, decide which refrigerator to buy, decide where the property is to be acquired, decide what car and refrigerator and TV and video and ovens are to be bought, how are they to be maintained. So he is under different pressures. Not that he is not under pressure, not that his motives are not there. Of course they are there, but because of their gender, they have different pulls and pushes. And that is how diversity in an organization in terms of gender has entered. एक और चीज जो इससे मुतल्लिक है वो ये आपको देखनी होगी, diversity in terms of education. In any given organization, you have people who may not be educated and people who are extremely highly educated. People who can't even read or write, and people who are on the verge of making new discoveries and new inventions. They are so creative in their educational pursuits. So their needs, their psychological motives are again different depending upon their educational experience, educational backgrounds, educational training. एक और जो आपको difference जो दिखाई देगा, that is due to ethnicity. Ethnicity means your belongingness to a particular region. I belong to Punjab, my ethnicity is Punjabi. Another person belongs to Balochistan, he is a Balochi. Another person belongs to the Peshawar area, he is a Pathan. Another person belongs to the Sindh, and he is a Sindhi. Now these are ethnic relationships or ethnic variable that we are talking about. Any given organization in Pakistan would employ people who belong to different ethnic backgrounds. Punjabis tend to think differently, eat differently, dress differently than let us say Pathans, or then let us say Balochis, or then let us say Sindhis. And Sindhis think differently, eat differently, dress differently. Of course, in a general way, they all dress alike and they all think alike. But there are those subtle psychological differences that come from one's ethnicity, belongingness to a certain region. And that is also a source of diversity in an organization. एक और source of diversity is one's cultural belongingness. If you went abroad in the United States of America, or Germany, or Japan, or China, or Vietnam, or Thailand, you would be a different person. There are people, hundreds of people, who belong to different cultural backgrounds, who are employed in the same company, let us say, for instance, in the United States of America. They come from Malaysia, the Indo-Pak subcontinent, they come from Europe, they are all employed in the same company. They all work together. Because of their cultural backgrounds, they are different. Their pushes and pulls and psychological makeups are different. So that is, cultural belongingness is another source of diversity in organizations. अब इससे थोड़ा सा आगे चलते हैं कि डाइवर्सिटी का क्या रिलेशनशिप है ग्लोबलाइजेशन के साथ, यानी हाउ डिड डाइवर्सिटी, जैसे मैंने पहले कहा, बिकेम सच ए हॉट टॉपिक इन ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल साइकोलॉजी। हमने लेक्चर नंबर 3 में आपको बताया था ग्लोबलाइजेशन से मुतल्लिक, और हमने आपसे गुजारिश की थी कि ग्लोबलाइजेशन का मतलब है फ्री फ्लो ऑफ कैपिटल, ग्लोबलाइजेशन का मतलब है फ्री फ्लो ऑफ गुड्स एंड सर्विसेज, और ग्लोबलाइजेशन का मतलब है फ्री फ्लो ऑफ लेबर। यानी कुछ लोग किसी वक्त भी किसी भी ऑर्गेनाइजेशन में जरूरी नहीं है कि उसी मुल्क से बिलोंग करते हों, दे माइट बी बिलोंगिंग टू अदर कंट्रीज। दैट देन इज वन रीजन व्हाई डाइवर्सिटी has become such a hot topic. Globalization, because of free movement of labor, organizations are becoming more and more prone to diversity. You would find more and more diversity in organizations because of globalization, and particularly because of vast movement of labor from one to another, to the third, to the fourth, and to the fifth place. That's one reason that we are talking about in terms of globalization that has led to diversity. एक और रीजन भी है डाइवर्सिटी का जिसका ताल्लुक ग्लोबलाइजेशन से ही है डायरेक्टली, जैसे चेंजिंग वर्कफोर्स की वजह से, लेबर मूवमेंट की वजह से डाइवर्सिटी हो रही है ऑर्गेनाइजेशन में, इसी तरह ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस में डाइवर्सिटी की रीजन जो है दैट इज ग्लोबलाइजेशन, particularly competitive pressure. इसका क्या मतलब है? अभी मैंने आपसे गुजारिश की that globalization means free flow of goods and services, which means that if I go to the bazaar today, I would be able to buy imported shoes, I would be able to buy imported sweets, imported ice cream, imported cars, imported pair of glasses, watches, whatever. Which means that in order for my organization to remain competitive, my organization must produce goods and services which are comparable or which have a competitive standard to the goods and services available otherwise. My organization, therefore, or any given organization, therefore, is under pressure from competition to produce best results, to produce best goods and services, to produce goods and services which are comparable to international standards. That's the only way that the organization will survive. And that is why the organizations have to employ, have to make use of the best people, the best brains, and the best technology, regardless of the age, the cultural belongingness, the gender, the technological achievement, the qualification of the person that they are employing. जब एक organization, when it is under competitive pressure to produce goods and services which are comparable to the best in the world, they have to have the best technology and the best brains available to them in an organization. In order for them to have the best brains and best skills available to them in an organization, the organization has to ignore all other differences and has to employ people on the basis of talent or skill. When talent and skill becomes the main ingredient of employment in organizations, then such factors as age and gender and ethnic backgrounds are ignored. When age, gender and ethnic background and factors of these types are ignored, then organizations employ people of all ages, of all ethnic backgrounds, of both the genders, they are not concerned with these factors. They are concerned only with the skill and the talent of the person. And that is why diversity is entering into organization with such rapid velocity, with such rapid speed, because of competitive pressure. अब आपको जो पाकिस्तान में भी ऐसा दिखाई दे रहा होगा कि हमारे अस्पताल, हमारी एजुकेशनल इंस्टीट्यूशंस, हमारे दूसरे इदारे, they are opening up and they are looking for the best talent. आपको मालूम है कि पाकिस्तान की हुकूमत ने इदारों को, एजुकेशनल इदारों को इस बात की तलकीन की है और इजाज़त दी है कि वो जहां से भी चाहें, गैर ममालिक से भी चाहें, तो स्कॉलर्स को बुला के एम्प्लॉय कर सकते हैं. एंड दैट इज वाई our educational institutions, our other institutions are being open to diversity. Competitive pressure. एक और रीजन जो है डाइवर्सिटी का मॉडर्न ऑर्गेनाइजेशन पे, वो है जैसे मैंने पहले कहा था, जिसका नाम जो रिलेटेड है ग्लोबलाइजेशन के साथ, दैट इज इंटरनेशनलाइजेशन ऑफ ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस. जरा थोड़ी सी बात में आपको डिटेल जाननी होगी और फिर आपको ये बात समझ आ जाएगी. इन ऑर्डर फॉर ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस टू एग्जिस्ट, टू रिमेन प्रॉफिटेबल ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस, टू ग्रो, टू एक्सपैंड, they have to internationalize. They have to internationalize. Because if the organizations, for instance, are product organizations, the raw material of that product organization may be expensive in the region where they are situated geographically. Their raw material is inexpensive in another region. So they have to go there and get their raw material from there. This is one reason for internationalization. Another reason for internationalization is that the labor may be expensive where the organization is geographically located, and they have to go to another area, another part of the world to hire inexpensive, cheap labor. And that is why they have to go into another region. And that is why they have to internationalize. In order to remain competitive, in order to remain profit generating, the organizations have to internationalize. When they internationalize, diversity is going to enter into them. Where they buy their raw material, that's a different cultural region. People are different, their needs are different. Where they employ their labor, that's a different cultural region. Their needs and their presses and their pushes and their motivations are different. That organization is becoming internationalized, and therefore diversity is entering into that organization. Now, these are some of the factors that are related to globalization and diversity in organizations. अब ये organizational diversity जो है, this has become a fact of life that psychologists, particularly organizational psychologists, have to live with, have to learn to adopt it, have to learn to get the better of it, and have to prove capable psychologists to be able to manage diversity and to be able to make the best of it, because this is the ground reality. Diversity is now a ground reality. All organizations of necessity have to have diversity. एक और भी आपको एंगल इसमें बताऊं, organizations that encourage diversity flower and go forward and remain competitive. Organizations that anticipate diversity and that celebrate diversity, that welcome diversity, become more competitive, become the leaders. इसलिए जरूरत इस चीज की है कि ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस जो हैं वो ज्यादा से ज्यादा डाइवर्सिटी को एनकरेज करें. ये नहीं कि डाइवर्सिटी को डिस्करेज करें, ये नहीं कि डाइवर्सिटी को मेंटेन करें, ये नहीं कि डाइवर्सिटी को एक्सेप्ट करें, बल्कि ये कि ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस के लिए ये जरूरी हो गया है कि वो डाइवर्सिटी को एनकरेज करें, इनवाइट करें. क्यों बताइए आप जरा. इसलिए कि डाइवर्सिटी की वजह से ही दे विल रिमेन कंपेटिटिव, दे कैन इंटरनेशनलाइज, दे कैन जनरेट प्रॉफिट्स, दे कैन एग्जिस्ट. इफ दे आर नॉट inviting diversity, then they are on their way out as an organization. Then they are headed for oblivion as an organization. That is why diversity for psychologists in organizational psychology has become such a hot topic. और यही इसकी नीड है. चलिए इससे आगे भी देखते हैं. How can psychologists manage, encourage, and help organizations with diversity? Psychologists can adopt two approaches in encouraging and managing diversity in organization. एक जिसको हम कहते हैं individual approaches to the management of diversity. पहले इसको देखते हैं. बहुत सी इसमें approaches हैं, बहुत से तरीके हैं, लेकिन दो तरह के तरीके जो हैं वो माहिरीन नफ्सियात अडॉप्ट कर रहे हैं ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल साइकोलॉजी में, और वो अडॉप्ट करते हैं और आपको अडॉप्ट करनी चाहिए अगर आप ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल साइकोलॉजी को अपना करियर बनाना चाह रहे हैं. मैं आपको एक और भी गुजारिश कर दूं इसी रेफरेंस में, और वो है कि मॉडर्न साइकोलॉजी में ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल साइकोलॉजी एक बहुत ही रैपिडली एक्सपेंडिंग फील्ड है. ये ऐसी फील्ड है जिसमें दर्जनों करियर्स हैं, जिसमें सैकड़ों अपॉर्चुनिटीज हैं, जिसमें हजारों तरीके हैं हेल्प करने के ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस को, और जिसमें करोड़ों और अरबों डॉलर्स हैं जो एक ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल साइकोलॉजिस्ट जो है वो कमा सकता है. इसलिए कि जब एक साइकोलॉजिस्ट किसी ऑर्गेनाइजेशन को हेल्प करता है तो उसका इंपैक्ट इतना ज्यादा है कि organization can repay the psychologist in astronomical amounts. Organizational psychologists, organizational behaviorists, organizational trainers, organizational development psychologists are making millions of rupees, dollars, pounds, provided they know their jobs. और यही इस बात का एक एविडेंस है that organizational psychology is the new emerging field in the 21st and 22nd century. चलिए अब इसको देखते हैं थोड़ा सा आगे चल के. इंडिविजुअल के तौर पर एक माहिर नफ्सियात, एक ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल साइकोलॉजिस्ट क्या कर सकता है? सबसे अहम बात तो यह है कि वो डाइवर्सिटी को एनकरेज और मेंटेन और उसको मैनेज करने के लिए एक चीज ये कर सकता है, ही नोज अबाउट द पीपल इन द ऑर्गेनाइजेशन as much as possible. He familiarizes himself. He has to familiarize himself with the people, their age. How many people are there who belong in the age group of, let us say, about 20 to about 30? As I said earlier on, their needs and their pushes and their motivations are different. How many people are there who belong in the age group of the 40s and 50s? As I said earlier on, their needs, their pushes, their motivations are different. How many people are there in an organization belonging to the, let us say, plus 60 age group? Knowing the people in terms of their age would equip a organizational psychologist with the capacity to be able to counsel, advise and direct them, and thus manage diversity. एक और चीज जो देख सकता है organizational psychologist वो है the cultural background. If he familiarizes himself with the culture of ethnic groups, for instance, or homogeneous groups in organizations, कि अगर organization में एशियन लोग हैं तो उनका कल्चर क्या है, यूरोपियन कल्चर क्या है, और इन दोनों कल्चर्स को कैसे वो इकट्ठा कर सकता है. Knowing about the diverse cultures of these two groups, for instance, would equip an organizational psychologist to be able to manage, to be able to encourage diversity in organizations. ये तो है उसकी learning technology, how an organizational psychologist may learn more and more so that his learning can help him to devise technologies to manage and encourage diversity in organizations. एक और चीज जो वो कर सकता है, that is empathy. He or she may develop empathy for the people in the organization. अब sympathy और empathy का थोड़ा सा फर्क करें. एक है EM, एक है SYM. We are talking about empathy. Empathy is feeling like somebody. किसी तरह अपने आप को दूसरे शख्स की जगह पे रख के उस शख्स की तरह महसूस करना जो है, that is empathy. Sympathy is किसी के लिए रहमदिली या हमदर्दी महसूस करना. We are not talking about sympathy here. We are talking about empathy. Appreciating the position of somebody in an organization. A psychologist may put himself in the position of different groups in organizations, people who have homogeneous groups, people who are different from others, put himself into their position, and then he would be able to feel like them, think like them, be motivated like them, and that would add to his knowledge. That would help him to know how he can manage diversity, how he can manage those people in the organization, how can he encourage diversity in the organization. और भी बहुत सी टेक्नोलॉजीज हैं जो कि हम, अगर आप ऊंची सतह पर जाके इसी सब्जेक्ट को पढ़ेंगे, ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल डेवलपमेंट को, तो उसमें वो टेक्नोलॉजीज आएंगी. बट फॉर द टाइम बीइंग, let us just confine ourselves to only these two approaches at the individual level that an organizational psychologist may adopt, learning more and more about the people in the organization and empathizing. आप जानते हैं एक तरीका एम्पथाइज करने का क्या है? रोल रिवर्सल. कि आप दूसरे शख्स की रोल प्ले करना शुरू करें. That makes you feel like the other person. That makes you behave like the other person. That makes you think like the other person. And then you're more appreciative of the other person. You're more understanding of the other person. And that is what empathy is all about. So these are the two approaches that the organizational psychologist may adopt. Let us take a look at some of the organizational approaches now. Organizational approaches वो हैं जिसके तहत माहिरीन नफ्सियात जो हैं वो ऑर्गेनाइजेशन को एडवाइस करते हैं कि ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस जो है वो क्या पॉलिसीज, रूल्स एंड रेगुलेशंस बनाए कि उससे डाइवर्सिटी ना सिर्फ मैनेज हो बल्कि एनकरेज हो. मैं आपसे पूछना चाहूंगा कि हम डाइवर्सिटी को मैनेज या एनकरेज क्यों करें? क्योंकि कहीं की ईंट कहीं का रोड़ा, भानुमती ने कुंभा जोड़ा, तो वो तो चलेगा नहीं कुंभा। तो ऑर्गेनाइजेशन में जिसमें तरह तरह के लोग हैं, कहीं की ईंट कहीं का रोड़ा, तो वो तो कुंभा नहीं चलेगा। तो आप बताइए, व्हाई शुड दी ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल साइकोलॉजिस्ट मैनेज डाइवर्सिटी एंड एनकरेज डाइवर्सिटी? अभी हमने बताया कि वो ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस जो डाइवर्सिटी को मैनेज नहीं कर पाती या एनकरेज नहीं करती, वो मुख्तलिफ वजूहात की वजह से अपनी कंपेटिटिव ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस के मुकाबले में पीछे रह जाएंगी। इसलिए जरूरी है कि ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस जो हैं, कोई भी ऑर्गेनाइजेशन, चाहे वो प्रोडक्ट ऑर्गेनाइजेशन है या सर्विस ऑर्गेनाइजेशन है, हमने आपको पहले भी ये बताया था, एक दफा फिर यादा कर लेते हैं इस बात का। प्रोडक्ट ऑर्गेनाइजेशन वो है जहां कुछ अशिया बनती हैं, जैसे जूते या आइसक्रीम या कमीज, और सर्विस ऑर्गेनाइजेशन वो हैं जहां कुछ सर्विसेज ऑफर की जाती हैं, जैसे किसी को पढ़ाना या कुछ स्किल सिखाना या कोई अस्पताल है। तो कोई भी वो ऑर्गेनाइजेशन हो, उसमें डाइवर्सिटी को एनकरेज करना जरूरी है। तो इसलिए ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल साइकोलॉजिस्ट के लिए यह भी जरूरी हो जाता है कि वो ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस को ऐसे तरीका हाय कार बताए जिन पर चलकर ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस जो हैं वो डाइवर्सिटी को न सिर्फ मैनेज करें बल्कि डाइवर्सिटी को मेंटेन करें, बल्कि डाइवर्सिटी को बढ़ावा दें, एनकरेज करें। वो कौन कौन से तरीके हैं? लेट अस टेक ए लुक एट देम आल्सो। सबसे पहली बात, दैट organizational psychologists should ensure that the entry, the procedure of tests through which people enter into employment of the organization are not culturally biased. अगर एंट्री के प्रोसीजर जो हैं वो सिर्फ ऐसे हैं कि जो औरतों को फेवर कर रहे हैं या मर्दों को फेवर कर रहे हैं या अंग्रेजी पढ़े लिखे लोगों को फेवर कर रहे हैं या कोई सी अफ्रीकन जुबान के बोलने वालों को फेवर कर रहे हैं, तो फिर उस ऑर्गेनाइजेशन में ऐसे लोग शामिल नहीं होंगे जो डाइवर्स बैकग्राउंड से आए हैं। इसलिए द फर्स्ट थिंग दैट द साइकोलॉजिस्ट्स, organizational psychologists have to ensure that all testing procedures for employment, for advancement in the organization, for recruitment in the organization, for selection of higher posts in the organization are culturally unbiased. एक तरीका ये है। दूसरा ये है, the organizational psychologists must introduce डाइवर्सिटी ट्रेनिंग इन ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस। दुनिया के बहुत से मुल्कों में, बेतहाशा मुल्कों में ऐसी ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस मौजूद हैं जिनमें डाइवर्सिटी ट्रेनिंग ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल साइकोलॉजिस्ट्स कर रहे हैं। ये डाइवर्सिटी ट्रेनिंग क्या है? डाइवर्सिटी ट्रेनिंग है लोगों को, ऑर्गेनाइजेशन में जो मौजूद लोग हैं उनको दूसरे लोगों के से ज्यादा मुतारिफ कराना। उन लोगों को जो ऑर्गेनाइजेशन में ऑलरेडी मौजूद हैं उनको एक दूसरे से मुतारिफ कराना इन टर्म्स ऑफ कल्चरल बैकग्राउंड, इन टर्म्स ऑफ एजुकेशनल बैकग्राउंड, डिफरेंसेस इन कल्चरल डिफरेंसेस, एजुकेशनल डिफरेंसेस, जेंडर रिलेटेड डिफरेंसेस, एज रिलेटेड डिफरेंसेस, जितने भी हमने डिफरेंसेस का नाम लिया है, उससे मुतल्लिक लोगों को ज्यादा से ज्यादा ट्रेनिंग और आगाही पहुंचाना, ये माहिरीन नफ्सियात का काम है और इसी चीज को डाइवर्सिटी ट्रेनिंग कहा जाता है। डाइवर्सिटी ट्रेनिंग माहिरीन नफ्सियात जो हैं वो कैसे कैसे कर रहे हैं? टीवी के जरिए से, क्लोज सर्किट टीवी के जरिए से, पैम्फलेटियरिंग के जरिए से, लेक्चर्स के जरिए से, प्लेज, छोटे छोटे रोल रिवर्सल के जरिए से, बहुत सी टेक्नोलॉजीज हैं जिसके जरिए से डाइवर्सिटी ट्रेनिंग हो रही, लोगों को ऑर्गेनाइजेशन में एक दूसरे के मुतालिक आगाही बहम की जा रही है। तीसरी चीज जो है इसमें वो है मेंटोरिंग। मेंटोरिंग मीन्स दैट द साइकोलॉजिस्ट्स बिकम like guides in the organizations for certain homogeneous groups. For instance, the organizations have employed people who have, let us say, Asian backgrounds. There are 5 people who come from Asian backgrounds in a given organization, let us say organization A. Mentoring means that an organizational psychologist mentors them, becomes a guide for them for the next 3 months or 4 months or 5 months, who introduces them to the organizational demands, to the organizational differences, to the organizational requirements, and introduces the various functions of the organization to these people. And that is the role of a mentor. Mentor जो है वो समझ लीजिए हमारे उसका अगर हम तर्जुमा करेंगे तो यूं समझ लीजिए कि ये एक पीर और मुर्शिद का वो रिश्ता है. तो mentoring जो है that is a role that is played by organizational psychologists, and that is another way of in which diversity is managed by organizational psychologists. एक और तरीका जो डाइवर्सिटी मैनेजमेंट का है जो साइकोलॉजिस्ट ने सजेस्ट किया है, जिसको एम्प्लॉय किया गया है, उसको हम कहते हैं adoption of family programs. If you have employed somebody in an organization, he is 26 years old, he's just gotten married, and he has just had a baby. You don't expect him to come 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, with total clear head, because he's just going through the process of an addition in the family and a marriage. So his energies and psychic energy is already divided. So what do? Do you throw him out? No, you don't. You give him what we call flex time or flexible time. That he doesn't have to come at 8 o'clock, he can come at 10 o'clock. He doesn't have to come from 8 to 5, he can come at 10 and he can stay here till 6:30, 7. That is called flex time or flexible time. That is what psychologists are suggesting. Adjusting organizational rules and regulations according to the needs of people in the organization within the parameter of organizational demands. ये नहीं है कि organizational demands को एक totally ignore कर दिया जा रहा है, उसको flexible किया जा रहा है. That is another approach that organizational psychologists have helped to employ for people in organizations, and that is called flex time. Another approach in that context is what's called job sharing. Organizational psychologists have developed what they call job sharing, and that you can understand by example of a mother. You have employed somebody in an organization and she has had a baby. Now she can come, let us say, not for 8 hours a day in your organization, but let us say 6 hours a day, because she has to feed the baby and look after the baby. So she can take out she cannot be there for 8 hours a day. So what do? You throw her out? No, you don't. Why don't you throw her out? Because employing her, selecting her involved real money, training her involved real money, and if you throw her out, that will double your cost. So you don't throw her out, you allow her job sharing. Psychologists have shown this way that maybe 2 people can do the same job for a certain set time period. And that is an example of job sharing. That is how diversity in organizations may be not only managed, but also encouraged. I've given you just 2 examples. Another example is what we call, or what organizational psychologists call, compressed work week. Let us say on the average, a person has to work 40 hours a week in an organization. Organizations, and that person cannot be available for 40 hours in a week. So what do organizations do? Organizations, given the opportunity, you can complete 40 hours not in 5 days, but maybe in 3 days. You can work 20 hours or maybe 18 hours a day, and you can complete your 40 hours a week in 3 days, and the rest of the 3 days you can take off. And that is what is called compressed work week. These are some of the ways in which organizational psychologists have developed organizational strategies to manage, maintain, and encourage diversity. Before we end today, let us look at what we've talked about. We've talked about diversity. We've seen how diversity has gained momentum in organizations. We've seen the various reasons why diversity has entered. We've seen that diversity is related to age and gender and education and culture and other factors. We've seen that diversity has emerged because of internationalization of organizations, because of competitive pressure. And then we have looked at some of the approaches that organizational psychologists can employ to not only manage diversity, but to be able to encourage diversity. Because if they do not manage diversity, if they cannot control diversity, and if they cannot make the better of diversity, then organizations tend to go from bad to worse. They would not remain competitive. The goods and services that they have to offer would become second-rate, and nobody in the world would be able to pick up their goods and services and use their goods and services. So organizations would not become or remain profit-generating organizations. They would not be expanding and future-looking organizations. And that is why diversity is such an important and hot topic in organizational psychology today. Do look at these chapters in your textbook. Do understand the need for diversity. And do remember that psychologists have suggested two ways of management of and encouragement of diversity. That is, what psychologists can do as individuals and what psychologists can make the organizations do so that diversity in the organizations is managed well and is encouraged. Until next time, Khuda Hafiz, God be with you.